thank you, Amanda, for joining us today. Amanda is from the Surrey Hills area in London. Beautiful place. I was certainly checking that out and want to put that on my bucket list to come over there and check that out for sure. I have always wanted to England. So Amanda, can you tell us about yourself and what you do?
Hello, my name is Amanda and I am an embroidery artist. I work here in the Surrey Hills, which is about 30 miles outside London, and it is a beautiful green area, densely wooded. Surrey is one of the most densely wooded counties in the UK. So I've got everything here at my fingertips in order for me to create the embroideries that I make, which are three-dimensional.
So what Amanda didn't say is that she's award-winning, has been exhibiting for quite some time, and certainly check out her website. We'll have that up here for you. And hopefully Amanda has some examples that she's going to show us as well. Those colors behind you just speak to me. The nature is just popping out with those colors. And so maybe tell us a little bit about the technique that you do in order to, when you're using the embroidery threads, how that comes into play.
So I largely work on either dissolvable fabric or something that I can either wash away or iron away. I also work on paper and non-woven materials, so like bonded materials as well, to give it some structure. If I'm making my pieces, then I don't pre-draw the pieces that I make, so I would go straight to the sewing machine. I would choose my threads and work my way up. So as if I was trying to recreate, say if I was making a piece of bark, I might start with a piece of non-woven fabric and then work into that on an embroidery hoop. So I still use for most work, I use my embroidery hoop just because I need that tension. And I just work up layer by layer. I always use 2 different color threads when I'm sewing, just because I think that, and I adjust the tensions on the sewing machine as well. So that allows me to quite often for the bottom thread just to pull through a little bit. So just getting tiny flecks of color. And I'd maybe start with a darker color and work my way up, adding the highlights and just the detail and the textures.
Right. So when you say you're using 2 different colors, the bobbin thread's one color and the top thread is a different color.
Yeah.
So you're kind of getting that texture to that. Yeah. Do you wind your own bobbins?
Yeah, I do.
You do. Okay.
Yes. Spend a lot of time doing that.
Getting them ready. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, they don't have as many colors in the bobbins, in the colored bobbins. So I can see how you would be doing that.
No, and also I like to mix it up with different weights of thread, which might be controversial for some people. They wouldn't necessarily use a different weight in the bobbin that they would on their spool, but I'm forever adjusting the tension on my machine in both in the bobbin case, right, and on on the top of my machine as well, just to get it quite right. But I often find with the really fine, like if I'm doing a lot of something that's really detailed, then the finer weight thread, really you can really get some good detail with that.
So for people that aren't aware of it, for embroidery, this is what you're doing is called free motion. So the machine isn't driving, you're driving, and you're using that needle to draw.
That's right. Yeah.
Create those. So having all those different colors and how you're playing with the tension is actually quite unique, because in typical embroidery, you don't want that bobbin thread showing. So the tension is set to balance that out. Yeah. You've mastered the art of your machine so well that you can bring that bobbin thread up where it needs to be to add the dimension to the colors. So that's quite cool. For anybody that looks at your products to start with, It's people have to say, "Oh, that's real," and then you get a little close, and they're like, "Oh, wait, that's not real." And it's so cool, and it's so cool that you can capture something like that, something like what you do with all the nature's products that you produce, because they have the longevity of staying that way as opposed to a real life one. And funny story, about 15 minutes ago, before we started, I went out to our courtyard, which we have on the side of our building that has rocks growing in it. And here in New England, New Hampshire especially, we have had so much rain this year, and we had the most beautiful bloom of mushrooms that were growing out of the rocks. And I'm like, oh, I wonder if they're still there. I think I'm gonna go grab them and just bring them in just to pay homage to what you do. But apparently the gardeners that came by took them out for us. So we don't typically have mushrooms growing all around us, but when we have a really wet season, they grow in the rocks as well.
But the thing is, they are forever changing. So what you see one day is going to have changed the next day as well.
Right.
And also, I guess you've got to do a bit of research. You've got to know what you're picking. You've got to know whether it's poisonous or not, for a start. And also, as soon as you've picked that thing, the likelihood is that it will start degrading really quickly.
Right.
So, and that's the reason I started doing this, because I go on a daily dog walk, and looking at all these things around me, thinking, wouldn't it be amazing? Because I'm making these observations all the time, and thinking, wouldn't it be amazing if you could find some way of preserving something, but obviously making something to appear like it's been preserved.
Right.
And I think that was part of the challenge at the beginning. It was to make something appear to be real that clearly could not be real, because these things don't last. And it's the same with lichens and the mosses. Everything dries out and then starts crumbling, and the fungi end up becoming some kind of mushy mess if you just leave them, or dry up completely and shrivel up. And I suppose the interesting part of the whole part of my job is interesting, but the science side of my job is to be able to make observations in nature and to document what we have. So that's really, from a science point of view, that's really important for us to know what we have. And if we know that when we pick something up that it's there, next time we look, or the next season that we go and look, or the following year, is it still going to be there? I'm hoping that the embroidery has a purpose beyond the beauty of embroidery. It has to have for its longevity. It has the point, I guess, that I want it to be as well, is for us to recognize what we have in nature and appreciate it and protect it.
Right. I mean, it's like you're doing a life-size replica or something that somebody that might be doing drawings,
So I'm like we were saying earlier, I'm drawing with my sewing machine, with my needle, and I'm just doing the same thing but in a three-dimensional way. So I'm actually making the object using thread, and it's the reason I kind of started doing it, because I trained as a printed textile designer, and I specialized in botanical print when I was drawing. So those were my sort of botanical illustrations. Went into print design for fashion garments and furnishing and things. So I've always kind of had that interest. And I suppose it's just that this has kind of been the follow-on from that, really, is having, using my observational skills and then finding a way of making something in a kind of domestic setting, really, because, you know, before I had my lovely studio that I'm working in now, I was working, you know, in a room in my house, and I could fit it in between my life with my young children, which was you know, as soon as I'd had a family, I had the ability to be able to change up my skill a bit, I suppose, from being a printed textile designer to being a maker, and then but using my knowledge in a different way in order to be able to still have, you know, use my creativity and still have that. I've always had that drive to create something, and this is just a different way of being able to do it, and I love doing it so much, and it's reaped the rewards because, you know, I hope it has that kind of integrity that that resonates with people.
So maybe you could share a little bit about how you went from printed material, you know, fabric in that way, to the embroidery aspect of it. You know, I know that embroidery, you know, plays a big part in the fashion world. Was it always there for you, or was that something you discovered kind of on the side?
Well, I obviously I'm not trained. I'm not a trained embroiderer, but I've had a sewing machine since I was very young and learnt to sew with my grandmothers, actually. I used to make dolls' clothes when I was really, you know, I remember having the sewing machine going when, 4, 5, when they first let me loose on the sewing machine, and I used to make all these little things. So I've always known how to sew, but I never thought I'd have a career ever in textiles. I always thought it would be a hobby or just something that I enjoyed doing. And like, you know, I just didn't think you could have a job in something you love doing. And
well, and that's the art world in general, right? I mean, you know, there's a lot of artistic people out there, and, you know, I have small skills, and I would have loved to have gone into the art world when I was younger. But computers weren't even a thing back in that day. And I think if it had been, I would probably be doing something different right now. But that aside, you know, that's a very common, you know, people, you know, you say, oh, I'm going to be an artist. And, you know, the very few people really excel at it.
I think that my parents have always had absolute belief in me, and I think that's a major thing when you're a creative person. You know, I'd always say I'm not hugely academic. I mean, you know, I do have a degree. However, I think I largely got that degree on my creative skill and not necessarily my academic achievements. And my parents they never pushed me into being anything other than what I wanted to be. And I think I just naturally gravitated towards being creative. My mother is also really, well, both my parents are creative. And they were both kind of denied that as when they were growing up. My mother wanted to go to art college and wasn't allowed to go, and ended up being a secretary, and I think she didn't want the same for me. So she always had absolute belief that I could do something or be something creative, and never pushed me to do anything more than that, really, I suppose. And it was a natural progression. It was a natural path. I'd studied textiles when I was at school, but again, loved it, but didn't think that I'd ever do it. And then studied when I was a bit older. I studied sculpture and photography, and kind of did the whole thing like you do when you're at art college, until I think I was 19, and one of my tutors said to me, "Oh, I think you'd like textiles." And I thought, oh, you know, is there a career in textiles? I don't know. Anyway, I did study printed textile design and absolutely loved it. But what you don't get with printed textiles design so much is the ability to physically make something. And I think that's from a child, and I think that's the reason I kind of did a sculpture, have got a sculpture qualification as well, is because I needed to physically make something to be able to hold it in my hand. You know, my mum used to say when I was very little, I would get bits of paper and I would roll them up and make them into shape. You know, I'd mold them into shapes when I was just, you know, preschool, and always exploring things, you know, very much, you know, hand eye, that sort of working out how something worked. And I remember I must have been about 5, and my dad taught me how to draw 3-dimensional objects. And just because that was, he's a draftsman, and that was his thing. And I had this conversation with someone, it must have been about 5 or 6 years ago, and I was like, well, everyone can visualize something in 3D, right? They'll get how it works. And then I had this whole, I was in a room with other people and they were like, no, how can you, what do you mean you can? I'm like, I can see something, like I will take something that I found in you know, in the forest, and I'm looking at that thing going, yeah, I know how I'm going to make that. I know how I can visually, that's how that's going to work. Where some people say, I don't know where to start. I suppose maybe I just do. I don't know. I just assumed everybody would work that out, but apparently they can't. So so I kind of feel like maybe that's a quality that has aided me in being able to make these things.
Right. And from a very young age.
I just think that it was it's just using your hands. You know, the other thing that I love doing, I love baking, I love woodwork, I love you know, wood turning, and anything that involves that sort of, you know, hand-eye coordination. And recently I did something with some pottery, and I couldn't believe how absorbing it is. But so it's that physical need to make, but also, you know, textiles is always, you know, especially being a 70s child, it was such a domestic handcraft skill that a lot of people my age were doing. That was their childhood. If you ask anybody who grew up in the 70s, they were probably making dolls' clothes. That was that was the thing that we all did, I think.
Absolutely. You didn't have a store down the street that sold them for $10 a piece. You know, you could go to the store and make them for $2 or less, you know.
But it was more fun because you were your own fashion designer, and that was what was exciting. And
I totally get the, you know, I'm not one to show off what I do because I feel, well, I'm self-conscious probably, but I enjoy it for myself. You know, if I do a drawing, or if I make something, or if I, you know, I'm learning a new technique or something like that, I like it for myself, and I'll probably show it to my husband, but I'm not the one that throws it up on Facebook and says, hey, look what I did. The most thing I'm proud of right now is I made this beautiful rotating stitch out display for our trade show. And everybody loves it and they think it's going to be really great, but I just love it for myself. And, you know, that's the kind of artist I am. And, you know, I envy people that are like, hey, look at me, look what I did.
It's such a personal thing though, isn't it? Because when you make a piece of art, you are literally laying your heart and soul on the line for people to comment and criticize. And when it's open to the public, you know, people that you're laying yourself open to it, aren't you, to criticism. And I guess when you do it enough, you get used to it. You know, I sort of feel that there are so many times, and I sit here and I think, is this terrible or is this okay? I really don't know what I'm doing, whether it's okay or not. However, I think you know, I think it really shows in your work when you're making something for anybody, whether they're stitching quilts or you know, flat pieces of embroidery or doing something that I'm doing. It has to have an integrity and an honesty about it, and it could be, almost the end result is almost irrelevant, because if it's got that love and it's how you feel about something,
Right.
somebody else will notice that. You know, even the most, when we look at the most basic, you know, like the most basic American well, you tell me, they're like the lovely they like patchwork imagery, sort of native, I think they're Native American, that we've got
So
some in
the quilts that are
the
made.
quilts.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the artwork that goes into the quilts is
but
just
they're basic, but they're so delightful, and they're so, you know, to own one of those, oh my goodness. And that kind of, and it's a bit the same with you know, like beautiful French embroidery, and I don't know, anything like cross stitch, anything gold work. Some of it is really precise, but some of it, we learned cross stitch when we were kids. You know, that was another thing that we learned to do, just on a basic stitch out thing, on a, you know, your little cross stitch.
Yeah.
And the back of it was probably utterly shocking, but you'd look back on those things now, and you kind of, if anybody still owns them, you cherish them, because there's something, they were made with really hot determination and love, and you're using your skill, and I think if you make any piece of artwork, if you're adding those elements, then you can't, how can you not love it? You know, I think those things are really important. And the thing that I see sometimes is when young artists are starting out, and they use another artist as a point of reference, but they end up replicating a piece of work. So they, you know, they'd see something and they go, I'm going to replicate that. And of course, it's never going to be the same as the original, because the original has the love and the integrity, and the replica,
right,
as good as it may or may not be, doesn't have that, because it wasn't that person's idea or that person's original piece of work. And that's the difference. Therein lies the difference, I think.
right. So tell us about, you know, your landscape around you and how that influences you with what you make. Share that a little bit with us.
So the Surrey Hills is, like I said before, it's a deeply wooded area. Although where I live here, so I live in a little village, and at the, I live at sort of, although we're up in the hills, we live in a valley. So we're at the bottom, our little cottage is at the bottom of this valley. So whichever way I want to go for a walk, I have to walk uphill. But so if I go at the back of my house, then there are lovely fields, and towards the front of my house, just over the road from our house, is the woods. And it's mainly, so it used to be heathland, and then during the 1940s, that heathland got planted. So there's a lot of pine, Scots pine, but that's mixed with deciduous trees. So we've got beech and oak, some silver birch, and some larch as well. So, and the ground is quite sandy, so it's fairly easy working. It's like originally it was natural heathland, and some of those areas have been returned back to heathland. So it's got quite a nice lot of diversity. There's little like brooks that run through the bottom of the forests when it's in the winter, when it's very wet, and it's akin to a sort of rainforest. So we have in the UK, there are patches of the UK that still has what you wouldn't assume that the UK had rainforest, but we do actually have some little areas of rainforest. And this little patch here is like a mini rainforest. So when it's really hot, you know, if the temperature here is really hot, then it's still quite cool in the forest. It's just a lovely place to go and walk and just be. And I think whilst I'm out walking, because of the diversity of the different kind of trees we have here and the landscape, that lends itself to a whole load of beautiful textural things, like bark, lovely barks, different textures, and different types of lichen and fungi, anything. So when I'm looking for things to embroider, so I'm not taking things up. I don't take things off trees. I try not to pick anything that especially if it couldn't be replaced, I would never pick it. There is a sort of foraging code that not everybody follows, but I do follow. A lot of whimful stuff would come back here. So what I do is, if I'm going out on my walk, I'm sort of looking for, and it changes throughout the whole year. So different seasons, you'll find different things.
Right.
And I'm then finding those objects and bringing them back or photographing them. I spend a lot of time with them, sort of, if I'm not bringing them back, then I want to feel how they are in my hands. And so I've kind of got that memory of how something. I'm doing this with my hands because I'm thinking about the mushroom that I touch.
You're creating it while you're talking.
Yeah, and that's how so if there's something that, even the feel of it, if it's really lovely and velvety, and if you go for a walk in the forest, you'll soon realize that there are a lot of things that are really textural, especially barks and things, and they suit working with thread. Not everything would. It's very difficult if you're working as a ceramicist to try and recreate these things in the same way. It's because the things that I find in the forest are so textural that they kind of lend themselves to thread, and I think that's a kind of how it is successful, because I can because the thread does the kind of work for me, really. And I suppose that's, so that's really, I walk daily. And
does anybody go with you on your walks?
Well, my dogs come with me.
So does he cooperate well? Does he cooperate well with you?
Well, I've got two dogs. The big dog does. The little one, not so much. So if I'm never stuck, but if I'm looking for something special, then I just take my big dog, because he's less likely to distract me. My husband's really good at finding as well, so he'd quite often come back, that he's found something he'll come back with. And other people, so locals, quite often leave things on my doorstep, whether I want them or not. They get left, and it's really lovely that it's just anonymously left. I think they get left on the doorstep. They think that if it's something that's interesting that they think I might like, it gets left for me, and that's really lovely. It's so lovely.
It is
that people do that, and find all sorts of wonderful things out there, and things that sort of unexpected shapes and colors. Like there's this lovely there's something called a green elf cup fungus, which I always rave about, because they're tiny, and I've not found the fungus around here, but what I have found is the infected wood, and the infected wood. So the fungus infects the wood and it changes the color of the wood and turns the wood this incredible blue-green color. And you can literally, if you can break it open, it's rotted wood, but you can break it open. So you find it on the ground, and then it's incredible, this blue-green wood. And in the past, I don't know if it's still used, but in the past it was used in marquetry. So it's just to give a different color. So it's an unexpected color. Why you wouldn't necessarily expect to find something blue,
absolutely blues in the sky, blues in the water, but you don't expect
not necessarily in the woods. So and loads of lovely oranges and bright yellows and
green.
some of the threads that are behind me.
I love them.
some of those
Yeah.
fluorescent, there's some fluorescent colors
The
there.
fluorescent greens that
Yeah,
kind of naturally show up.
yeah,
Yeah, some of the things that you do, some of, I don't know them as well, especially the lichen, but some of them looks like coral. So
yes,
I could see how somebody would take this underwater
yeah.
and create
Well,
the coral.
this is part of my, as soon as I get a chance, this is my next project. So at
Uh-huh.
the moment, I'm working on a big project in the Scottish borders. So I went up to the Scottish borders to do my research, and this is sort of like a year's worth of work, which I'm doing for it. And then I've got a couple of other things, but doing some seaweeds and sort of shoreline things is part of one of my next projects, which is very exciting. So
That's very,
yeah,
very exciting. I
yeah.
look
So I'm
forward
not,
to seeing that.
yeah. So I'm not necessarily only ever going to do forest stuff. It's just something that lends itself to texture, and also I love a challenge, and I think that's partly why I make these things, because it's a challenge, and you kind of need to, or I kind of need to challenge my brain all the time. Like, how am I, if I see something, how am I going to make that work? How can I put something together to
I
make
think
it work?
after your Scottish adventure, I think you need to do some scuba diving and get down with the coral, and that would be great. Imagine all the colors.
Oh, I know, incredible. Yeah.
So I'd like to go back to the embroidery aspect of it, as far as the free motion embroidery that you're doing. The fabric or the film that you embroider on is water soluble, right?
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit, maybe how you discovered it and how it kind of changed your abilities to create what you do.
Yeah. So before I started with free motion embroidery, I knew absolutely nothing. I'm coming at it from a total amateur point of view. My sewing knowledge was really basic: sewing clothes, sewing dolls' clothes, making a cushion, just that is it. And my mother-in-law introduced me to my sewing machine because it was gifted to me by one of her friends, and I knew nothing about even free motion embroidery or what the capabilities of it were. Nothing. So she showed me the basics, and then she gave me a piece of this clear film, which is called Romeo here. I don't know what you call it, whether it's water soluble film.
Yep, water soluble films.
Yeah,
kind of the generic name for it.
Yeah. And I was like, what is this stuff? What are you giving me? Why do I need to dissolve something in water? And she just showed me the basics. She said, you've got to connect your stitches. You've got to work out how to make something. And I'm saying to her, but why, what would you use this stuff for? Why would you use it? And I couldn't, I couldn't see what the purpose of it was until I then started thinking, how am I going to start recreating some of the things that I can find in the forest? And then it kind of came back to me. I was like, oh, I know what I can do with that water soluble film now. I can create shapes with it, because I think if I've worked out that, because so let's go back a bit. When I was a printed textile designer, I also used to design things for tableware. So I would be given the shape of a bowl or a plate, and then I'd have to put my design around this shape. Making a mushroom cap is a similar thing. You've got to work out what the shape is of the cap so what shape to sew in order for it to make that shape.
Right.
So it was hugely beneficial to me to work out, what shapes I'm creating on a flat piece of soluble film, in order for me to then wash that and be able to sculpt with it, which is basically what I do. So
Right.
and it also, for the tiny bits, I think I've got a piece here. So for the tiny bits of these, you see that, the tiny bits of lichen, And this is on 2 different types of soluble film. So there's the one that looks more like fabric, which is the non-see-through one, and then the other one is the see-through side. And the only reason I put these 2 together is because if I put 2 of the same thing together, well, the 2 of the non-clear one tends to rip if I do this type of pattern, and 2 of the clear one is just too thick, and it makes it too gooey and too difficult to work with. So this is a good compromise.
It also gives you, I would imagine it also gives you a nice like platform that you can see as well. And I know exactly what you're talking about with it. It's like a fibrous wash away thing that, you know, both of those, the nice thing about them is that they wash away completely. You can leave a little bit of it in there to help you mold it and shape it. This is very common. So in the industry with regular embroidery, this would be called freestanding lace. You embroider on these and you can do little circles or whatever shape you want to. You know, they do butterflies, they do, and once it's washed away, you're left with thread. And thread is just so malleable. An example I have that I've done recently that is on the stitch out display we have is a beautiful monarch butterfly that's so colorful with the oranges and the black and the white. But I can mold it so she's got her wing sticking out. So and it's just thread. And it just makes it so much more malleable than you know, if you have your backing in your garment.
And that's exactly how I use it, in exactly that way. So I just I wash it just enough for me to then be able to sculpt with it. It's been a challenge. It is a challenge when you're doing something very, very small, though, I have to say. So if I can show you this here, I don't know if you can see that. So it's tiny bits of, and trying to
do you use the really thin thread for that?
Sorry, do I use?
Do you use the really thin thread to create something like that?
So I'm using something really fine. It's the same with this. So this is a tiny piece in, and so that I'm having to use like 100 weight or 75 weight threads, just in order to just get that detail, because I think the thicker, I don't use like 30 weight thread or anything under 40 I don't use at all. And the 40 weight threads I'm only really using to put down first, so I'm putting those just to cover areas, and then I stitch in, you know, when I'm layering up. So if I'm making a piece of bark, so say for this piece, this is so I've made the bark as well as the
that is just so amazing.
Little bits of fungi that go on the top of it as well.
So the 40 weight, which is what people regularly use for embroidery,
so that was just like doing this bit here for the bark.
It's more of a foundation.
Because so once I've got a base down, I can then work back into it. But what I do, which I find really useful, is to put a piece of this underneath. So I'd have my my bonded fabric or a non-woven fabric that I would use, which I quite often use. I don't know what this stuff's called. It is from Madeira, these little squares.
So we would call that stabilizer or a backing. So that's what we put on, put underneath a garment when you embroider it, so it holds the design together. So essentially you're using that.
So I use
you
that.
Ever embroider on that?
I embroider straight onto that. And then I would, if once the back of that is heavily embroidered, then I just add another piece to the back, because quite often, especially if I'm changing the tension on the machine, that would start getting messed up on the back. You know, like I'd start. Eventually, I would just be stop-start the whole time, because my needle was getting caught in the threads at the back. So I try and just you have to kind of do it enough not for it to become too flat, because if it's too solid, you can't do anything with it. So it's about getting the I don't know, just
It's like a balance. You
yeah.
need a balance of
Yeah,
not too thick and
exactly
not
that.
too
It's getting the
thin,
right
and
balance of not having too much thread, but just having enough to be able to cover it and then be able to put layers on. And obviously I'm using different needles all the time as well. So I use, I quite often use a needle for metallic thread, because that doesn't shear the threads. So if I'm using, so if I'm just using regular 40 weight thread, I think if it gets if the piece of work gets quite thick and you're using, like the needle eventually it's trying to cut into your thread,
right.
especially if I'm changing the tensions the whole time. So I then would maybe tend to swap to a leather needle or a denim needle, and just because not only is it going through that thickness, but it's also not going to shear my thread on the way in and out either. So
Right. So it's not going to fray and come apart.
No.
That
And
makes sense.
yeah, I mean, someone would probably look at me sewing who was a professional and go, oh my God, what's that girl doing? But
it's just so totally different than regular sewing and regular embroidery. But then, you bring back the free motion embroidery into it that most people, they create. So, as a fiber artist, we have people that do similar stuff to yours, but it's on a 2D, two-dimensional, not the 3. But they're just creating the texture on top of, specific fabrics and things like that. And the texture that's created with the free motion is really what it's all about.
Yeah.
It's similar. It's also similar to what you would do if you're quilting. If you're an old school quilter and you're quilting your fabrics together, you have that free motion in order to make the designs that you want to be, the quilting part of the quilt. But yes, it's so totally unique, and it's what caught our attention. We love seeing, embroidery is just so huge in the industry around the world. And it's beautiful. I have some beautiful stitch outs over my shoulder here. Some I've done, some others have done. But I love wearing embroidery, but I don't wear it as much as I probably should. But I do love the artwork that it creates. And that's not the norm of embroidery in the industry. The norm is, corporate logos on your business shirt, and things like that. That's what the bigger part of the industry is. But getting down into these little niches is what's so unique and fun about it. And it shows people that, you can be artistic and embroider.
I mean, when you think about all traditional embroidery, especially with national costumes and things, the embroidery on it is incredible. And French lace, and I'm friends with a wedding dress designer, and they do all of their own embroidery, their lace embroidery, and it's so intricate and incredible. And it's something that I always feel like it gets a bit forgotten about. And I just wish everybody, I'm obsessed with embroidery and embroidered garments, but like you, I probably don't wear them as often as I probably should. I think it's because you kind of want to protect them as well. I sort of feel like I protect them, which is silly really, but because I'm working in the studio all the time, I feel like if I wear anything nice, I don't want to ruin it. Even though you think, I'm sewing all the time, I'm not just sewing because, there are other elements involved in the making of this work, which are, there's some burning elements, there's drilling, there's all sorts of other things that happen in the making of this work. And I don't wear my best clothes to work like everybody else, I suppose. And I was
watching the video. Actually, could you talk about the burning that you do to create the bottoms of the fungi?
So
cool.
So I use a pyrography tool to do the burning. So it's a little bit like a soldering iron, And what you can't see in the video, which I can assure you that I do, is wear a mask, because nobody wants to smell acrid or breathe in acrid fumes. But yes, I use that. And, with man, well, I'm using both. So I do use some cottons and use elements of wool, but not that much. It's mostly, polyester, nylon threads, and some silk sometimes as well. But they all obviously have a different burn to them.
Right.
And a lot of them would just melt or smolder or do whatever. So I'm careful about how I do it. I always do it in a well-ventilated room and wear a mask. But what that does is it kind of adds that element of decay. And to me, it feels like that's important, because the pieces that I find are quite often, especially if they're windfall, then they're pieces that are on their way out rather than just about to bloom. Not always, because I am doing different things. I am doing some things that are just about to come out. However, the pyrography tool it just adds that little bit of element of things that are just beginning to decay. And there's something that sort of, it's kind of control but not control. It's sort of organized chaos, I suppose, in doing it, because you're never quite sure how a piece of work is going to react to anything that's burnt on it. But it kind of just feels like that's part of nature, that nothing is perfect. You don't want to make something and make it look perfect, because although you hope when people look at it, people go, oh my goodness, that's perfect, but it's not, because nature is not perfect.
It is not at all. And that's where your marking comes in, your skills with the marking, because that is a challenge for a young artist, because it's more implied as opposed to exact. And, you have to let go of that perfectionist. You're not going to draw every clapboard on a house. And it's kind of the same way there, where it's natural. But I loved it, on the stems of the mushrooms, and the naturalness of it, that, the browns and the blacks are created. You could simply draw those on if you wanted to, but the natural look to it that's achieved with that pyro tool just really lended itself. So we'll definitely
and I think it's the sort of random nature of it, of using it, is quite freeing in a way, because like I say, you don't always know how it's going to turn out, what's going to happen when you use it. And that definitely lends itself to, I don't know, I literally like to play with fire. I like to go,
who doesn't, right?
Will this go wrong? This could go wrong at any moment and I could ruin it.
So Amanda, where do you get your Madeira thread?
I get it direct from Madeira, UK. I can order it one day and then the next day it is here. So it is brilliant. And there's a really good choice. I would dearly love to have the whole spectrum of color. I don't know if I've got enough room on my walls. And I'd actually at some point like to try out the Pantone color matching. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to make that work, but I always see it pop up and think I would really love to give that a go.
So if you're using polyester, there's like 422 colors that you could spread out on your wall. That's a big rainbow of colors. We have a thread room here that we have a whole room dedicated to all the threads. It's quite beautiful, and it's quite, as the in-house embroiderer here, it's really nice to have a nice supply in the embroidery room, but it's a color I need that's not there. It's only a few steps down the hallway and I can go borrow it from the thread room. Having all those colors is quite nice. A lot of the embroidery that I do, I try to mix the different types of threads that we have. I also, love doing the shading, which I'm sure is involved with yours, so maybe a lot of it's browns, whites, and tans. But there's a lot of browns, white, and tans, and the shading that's accomplished that you would be doing to replicate nature is quite nice.
Well, I always think you can never have enough brown. You can never have enough green. I'm always looking for the perfect brown. And I think I've probably got almost every single brown going to just, and I mix those two brown. I would mix two together as well to try and get to replicate the exact color that I want. And it's the same with the greens. And it is a bit of an obsession. I'm so excited if I put in an order. I'm just desperately waiting for the postman the next day so I can get my threads. I'm like, this is like the best thing of the week is receiving threads, because it's just so exciting.
There's some multicolors in the browns and greens.
I've got them.
Line. So you do have them. Awesome.
Yes. I've got all of them. I've got all the browns. The colors that I don't buy as often are pink and purple, even though there are some, there's a fungi called an amethyst deceiver, which is a lovely sort of lilac-y color, and what goes from lilac to purple depending on what stage in its life it's in, and or where you find it. And so I do have some purples, but I always think, it's always surprising that the colors that you use. So I made a piece of bark recently, and the back of it is, I used pink because it just popped up through. And somebody came to my studio the other day and I was showing her this piece of work, and she went, the back is pink. Like, yeah, because that pink, those tiny flecks of pink are just popping up through, and it was the exact right color for what I needed. So it's quite surprising when you mix your colors, what you do end up with, or what you think especially when you play with the tensions. But I don't know, maybe as an embroiderer you shouldn't advocate keep changing the tension on your machine or on your bobbin. I don't know, it works for me. It probably doesn't work for everybody.
I always say when it's artistic work, like it's meant to be artistic and creative, it's not going to go through a laundry, right? You're not going to throw it in the washer like a regular one. So it's totally different what you're doing than typical embroidery. So changing your tensions and mastering it on a sewing machine / embroidery machine is very, very unique. And you should be proud of yourself for being able to do that, because on the other side of the spectrum, when you're doing embroidery, you need your tension to be exact to create that smooth embroidery. That's a challenge to do in and of itself as an embroiderer. So for you to have taken that and turned it upside down to create what you do is just quite amazing. So I would be proud of your ability.
Thank you. I'm pleased about that.
Yes. So yes, other people, actual, regular embroiderers are going to be like, wait, I need my tension to be the same. But no, when it comes to artistic, you have a lot more license to change things up, whether it's, the fabric, maybe the backing that you're using might be a little different because it's not going to be washed. When something is not going to be washed, it's not going to go through that rigorous, wear and tear of that. But just, fiber artists are out there, and they're pushing things to the limit, and they're, the creative things that they're making are just outstanding.
Long may that last. Let's hope. Long may that last. Just, there are some incredible artists out there. I agree. If we can all of the embroidery artists, I just feel like I'm here in my little corner of Surrey, just quietly going about my business, going, here, have some more embroidery, everybody. But if I can, I'm the first one to shout and say embroidery is such a I feel such a deep connection to it, and it's definitely feels like when I'm stitching, like it probably does for a lot of people, whether they're doing hand embroidery or machine embroidery, it's that you're very much, I feel like I'm really marking a moment in time with my stitching. So each moment, every stitch is like marking a moment, and to that end, I suppose when I'm making my embroideries, I've kind of said, I'm here, and that this is my work, and these are my my stitches are proving that I've existed, that I'm here, that I've done something, and hopefully in the same process, somebody is then going out into nature and being reminded, whether they've seen the work or whether they see the things in nature and are reminded of me, or vice versa. Hopefully, if they see my work, then go out in nature and discover those things for themselves, my job is done.
There you go. That's awesome. Yeah, because I am a detail-oriented person. So if I'm walking in the woods, hiking and things like that, I do pay attention to those little things. Yes, it's great to be out there breathing fresh air and just being outside in general. But details for me are quite important. I love little details. I love, even in the garments I wear, I like something a little, I don't like it flashy. I like it subtly different. So, tone on tone is one of my favorite things to do when it comes to embroidery and wearing embroidery. But definitely.
Did you, just as a side note, I don't know if you read anything about the embroideries from the King's coronation, but the King and Queen had little details embroidered into their garments, and Camilla had 2 little dogs embroidered into her beautiful dress that she was wearing. And there were other details, so little flowers that are personal to both the King and Queen, and all sorts of little things. And that tells the story, and that's what's so lovely. It's not shouting at you. It's just a tiny little detail that maybe only, things that are personal to you, and those are things that only
a select few people know about it, see it, or notice it. And it's not a life-size dog embroidered on the back of her gown.
They were tiny. They were tiny, just on the brim.
That means so much. And you go back to hundreds and hundreds of years ago when the hand embroidery was done, and just how personal that all was. And it's
telling your story.
Amazing. It's telling a story.
That's how I feel about embroidery. If it's telling my story, or who anybody else who is embroidering, if it's telling your story, then that's the thing that makes it intrinsically beautiful and very special.
Okay, Amanda, it was so very nice talking to you. You're such a lovely lady, and your work is just beautiful. We'll be hope people are going to enjoy us showcasing it here during this video. And we're going to leave your information here at the end, where your products can be seen and enjoyed. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.